The airport was buzzing with the usual chaos: passengers rushing to catch flights, the distant hum of announcements, and security officers keeping a watchful eye. Among them was Officer Greg Wilson, a no-nonsense air cop with a reputation for being tough on rules. He prided himself on treating everyone the same, no special treatment, no exceptions. But today, he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. A man in an expensive suit approached the security checkpoint, walking with quiet confidence. He placed his carry-on bag on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector. A loud beep filled the air. Greg's eyes narrowed as he gestured for the man to step aside. "Sir, I need you to remove any metal objects and try again," Greg said, his tone firm. The man gave a slight nod and pulled out a set of keys. He stepped through again. Another beep. Now, Greg was getting suspicious. "I'm going to have to do a full check," he said, reaching for his radio. The man sighed, clearly annoyed. "Is this really necessary?" Greg folded his arms. "Airport security isn't optional, sir. Step over here." Passengers in line watched as Greg patted the man down. Then he picked up the briefcase from the conveyor belt. "This needs to be searched." At this point, the man's patience seemed to run thin. "Officer, do you know who I am?" Greg smirked. He had heard this line too many times. "I don't care who you are. Everyone follows the same rules." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out an ID. Greg barely glanced at it before scoffing. "Nice try, buddy. Anyone can print a fake badge." People around them started whispering. A few even took out their phones. The tension in the air was thick. Greg wasn't backing down. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're acting suspicious. Hands where I can see them." His hand hovered near his holster. But before he could take any further action, another officer rushed over, face pale. "Greg, stand down." Greg frowned. "Why? This guy?" "That guy," the officer cut in, voice shaking, "is the U.S. Attorney General." A heavy silence fell over the area. Greg felt his stomach drop. His grip on the briefcase loosened. The Attorney General straightened his suit, eyes locked onto Greg's. The air cop had humiliated one of the most powerful figures in the country. And in the next few moments, karma was about to strike in a way Greg never saw coming. Greg's mouth went dry as he stood frozen, his mind racing. He had just treated one of the most powerful men in the country like an ordinary suspect. No, worse than that. His heart pounded as the Attorney General locked eyes with him, his expression unreadable. Passengers whispered, a few shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether they had just witnessed the downfall of an officer or something even bigger. The second officer, still tense, took a careful step forward. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice filled with unease. The Attorney General, still adjusting his suit, finally spoke. "No need for apologies. Your officer was thorough." His tone was calm, but there was something behind it, something that sent a chill down Greg's spine. Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. His usual confidence, the sharp authority he carried, all seemed to crumble. He had worked security for years, always believing he had a good instinct for people. But now, he wasn't so sure. The Attorney General glanced down at his briefcase, still in Greg's hands. Without a word, Greg set it on the table. His fingers twitched, half expecting to be escorted out of the airport right then and there. But instead, the Attorney General did something unexpected. He let out a small, almost amused breath. "You take your job seriously," he said, studying Greg. "That's rare these days." Greg stiffened, unsure whether it was a compliment or a warning. The Attorney General picked up his briefcase and turned slightly, as if ready to walk away. But then he hesitated. "Tell me, Officer Wilson, what made you so suspicious of me?" Greg swallowed hard. "You set off the detector twice. Most people get nervous, but you didn't flinch. That's unusual." A small smile flickered across the Attorney General's face. "Interesting." He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to his wife. Asterisk landed safely. Can't wait to see you, asterisk. He debated telling her about everything that had happened, but decided to save it for later. It was a story best told in person. Mia walked a few steps behind, still processing everything. She had always known that moments of injustice happened, but today she had seen firsthand how easily someone could be singled out for no reason other than prejudice. She also knew she had a choice. She could ignore it, or she could make sure it never happened on a flight she worked again. As she reached the crew exit, the supervisor caught up to her. "You handled yourself well back there," he said. "We need more people like you on these flights." Mia smiled but then hesitated. What's going to happen to Rebecca? The supervisor sighed. There were already complaints against her. This incident just sealed it. HR will handle the rest, but let's just say she won't be working on another flight anytime soon. Mia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. As much as she disagreed with Rebecca's actions, she knew that losing a job wasn't easy. But at the same time, accountability mattered. No passenger should have to go through what Marcus had endured. Meanwhile, Eric strolled past a coffee shop, still scrolling through his phone. He had posted about the incident, nothing extreme, just a brief recap of how a passenger had been mistreated and how karma had played out. The comments were already rolling in. Some people shared similar experiences, while others applauded how things had turned out. He grinned, shaking his head. "The internet loves a good justice story," he muttered. Outside the terminal, Marcus took in the crisp evening air. A taxi pulled up, and as he climbed in, he took one last look at the airport behind him. He had entered this journey expecting a quiet flight, but life had thrown him something else entirely. As the car pulled away, he leaned back, finally allowing himself to relax. No anger, no frustration, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, for once, the right thing had happened without him having to fight for it. And that, he thought, was a rare thing indeed. Greg nodded, but his mind was already racing. He had seen the way the Attorney General carried himself, calm, calculated. That wasn't the look of a man who just wanted to move on. He had a feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As Greg left the office, he pulled out his phone. He needed to do some digging. If the Attorney General wanted his information, it was only fair that Greg got some in return. He ran a quick search, scanning through news articles, speeches, and government records. It was all standard stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. But then something caught his eye. A small, buried article from a few weeks ago. A whistleblower in the Attorney General's office had gone missing. No major outlets had covered it, just a handful of independent journalists. The official story: the man had resigned and left the country. But Greg had been in law enforcement long enough to know when something didn't add up. He clicked on a link, his eyes scanning quickly. The whistleblower had been investigating high-level corruption, his last known location: an airport. Greg's stomach twisted. Asterisk was that why the Attorney General had been so calm when I stopped him. Because he had been expecting security to take an interest in him, asterisk. His thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Officer Wilson," a voice on the other end said. It was deep, steady, familiar. Greg gripped the phone tighter. "Who is this?" There was a pause. Then, "Next time, don't be so quick to pull your gun." Greg's blood ran cold. The line went dead. His pulse pounded in his ears as he looked around, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. He scanned the terminal, his training kicking in. Was someone watching him? He had been in tight situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about airport security anymore. This was something bigger, something dangerous. And now he was in the middle of it. Greg's hands felt clammy as he lowered the phone, his mind spinning. That voice, it had been controlled, deliberate. A message, not a warning. Someone wanted him to know they were watching. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Whoever had called him wasn't just some random threat. They knew his name, his job, his exact role in the airport. That meant they had access to information most people didn't. And that meant one thing: this went higher than he thought. Daniels approached from behind, his expression tense. "You good?" Greg forced a nod. "Yeah, just long day." Daniels didn't buy it, but he didn't push. "You should get out of here, man. Go home. Clear your head." Greg almost agreed. Almost. But something told him he couldn't walk away from this. Not yet. He glanced around the terminal one last time before heading toward the security office. The moment he stepped inside, his supervisor, Richards, was already waiting. "Wilson. Sit." Greg stayed standing. "Something's going on." Richards sighed. "I told you to drop it." "Yeah. Well, dropping it isn't an option anymore," Greg shot back. "I just got a call. No name. Just a voice telling me not to pull my gun next time." Richard's face darkened. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're in deep, Wilson." Greg crossed his arms. "Then tell me what I'm missing." Richards hesitated, glancing at the door as if checking for eavesdroppers. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "You weren't the only officer to flag the Attorney General today." Greg's pulse quickened. "What?" Richards nodded. "Before you stopped him at security, another officer ran his name through a private database. Someone off the books. 15 minutes later, that officer clocked out early, disappeared." Greg felt a cold chill settle over him. "And nobody's looking into that." Richards let out a bitter laugh. "You think we have that kind of power? This is bigger than us, Wilson. Way bigger." Greg clenched his jaw. He had been right. This wasn't just about him stopping the wrong person at security. Something was happening behind the scenes. Something dangerous. His mind raced back to the missing whistleblower, the Attorney General's eerie calm. The phone call. Now another officer was missing. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a cover-up. Before he could respond, the overhead intercom crackled to life. "Officer Greg Wilson, please report to Terminal 4. Immediate assistance required." Greg exchanged a look with Richards. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew. Whatever was waiting for him at Terminal 4, it wasn't good. Greg's pulse pounded as he strode toward Terminal 4, his mind racing through every possibility. The missing officer, the Attorney General's unsettling composure, the warning call, it all pointed to something big, something dangerous. The moment he reached the terminal, he spotted a group of security personnel huddled near a restricted area. A baggage door stood slightly ajar, a red warning light blinking above it. One of the officers turned as Greg approached. "Wilson, you need to see this." Greg stepped through the door, his stomach tightening. In the dimly lit storage area, just beyond a row of conveyor belts, lay an abandoned security badge. He picked it up, flipping it over. The missing officer's name was printed across it. He frowned. "Where's the officer?" The others exchanged uneasy glances. Nowhere to be found. Security footage cuts out right before he left. Greg's fingers clenched around the badge. That wasn't an accident. Someone had erased the footage. His gut told him it all led back to one person, the Attorney General. He turned to the officers. "I need to check the logs. Every entry, every ID scan, anything that shows who accessed this area." Before anyone could respond, a voice behind him sent a chill down his spine. "That won't be necessary, Officer Wilson." Greg turned sharply. Standing in the doorway, adjusting his cufflinks as if nothing was out of place, was the Attorney General himself. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The other officers instinctively stepped back, sensing the weight of the moment. Greg squared his shoulders. "You seem to be showing up in a lot of places you shouldn't be." The Attorney General smirked. "And yet, you're the one asking all the wrong questions." Greg tightened his grip on the badge. "One of my officers is missing, and something tells me you know why." The Attorney General stepped forward slowly, his voice calm, deliberate. "Let me give you some advice, Officer Wilson. There are two kinds of people in situations like this: those who look too closely, and those who know when to look away." Greg held his ground. And which one was the officer who disappeared? The Attorney General studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "It's a shame, really. You have good instincts, but you're in over your head." Before Greg could respond, a new voice crackled over the intercom. "Flight 237 to Washington, D.C. now boarding." Greg's eyes flicked to the screen behind him. He barely had time to register the flight number before the Attorney General turned toward the door. "Careful what you chase, Officer Wilson," he said smoothly. "You might not like what you find." And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Greg stared after him, his mind spinning. Then he looked down at the badge still in his hand. Only now, he noticed something new. A tiny slip of paper had been tucked behind it. He unfolded it, his breath catching at the handwritten words inside. Asterisk, he's not who you think he is. Check gate 12. Now asterisk. Greg's heart pounded as realization hit him. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning. Greg's grip tightened around the slip of paper, his pulse racing. Gate 12. Someone had left him this message, someone on the inside. He didn't have time to question it. He had to move. He pushed through the terminal, his eyes scanning the crowd for anything unusual. When he reached gate 12, he slowed his pace, trying to blend in. The area was quiet, just a handful of passengers waiting for their flight. Then he saw him. Near the farthest seat, half hidden by a newspaper, sat the missing officer. He looked up just as Greg approached, his expression guarded. "Wilson," he said, his voice low. "I was starting to think you wouldn't come." Greg sat beside him, keeping his voice calm. "You disappeared. They erased the footage. What happened?" The officer exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I was digging too deep. I found something I wasn't supposed to." He slid a flash drive into Greg's hand. "Everything's on there. The real reason the Attorney General was at the airport. The whistleblower, the cover-ups. It's all connected." Greg's stomach twisted. What's on it? Greg knew what that meant. This officer wasn't just passing off evidence, he was running. "Where are you going?" The officer glanced toward the boarding gate, then back at Greg. "Somewhere they won't find me." Greg's mind raced. He had come looking for answers, and now he held them in the palm of his hand. But what came next? A voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Final boarding call for flight 237. Greg turned his head just in time to see the Attorney General walking toward the jet bridge, his posture as composed as ever. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He was untouchable. Greg's fingers closed around the flash drive. He could turn it in. He could expose everything. But then what? Would it even matter? The officer gave him a knowing look. "Be careful, Wilson. You don't get second chances with people like him." Greg nodded, his mind heavy with the weight of it all. As the missing officer disappeared into the crowd, Greg sat there for a long moment, staring at the drive in his hand. Then finally, he slipped it into his pocket and stood up. One thing was certain, he wasn't walking away from this. Not yet.